Our next session is a panel. Let me bring everybody onto stage. We have Paul, we have Angeli, we have Johanna or Johanna, however it is pronounced. Could be anything. There we go. We've got some names. This next session is a short one again, so I'm going to keep the intros really quick and hand straight over. And the panel discussion is about ethnography and UX research. So, Paul, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Hear you perfectly.
Good. Well, that was the shortest introduction ever. Thank you very much.
I just don't want to take any of your time.
No problem. Hi, everyone. My name is Paul Mcinerney, and I'm one of the people who runs TorChi. So TorChi is a UX professional organization that's been serving the Toronto area for over 25 years. The topic of our session today is ethnography and UX research. And we'll look at questions like what is an ethnographic approach to UX research, and how are organizations adopting this approach? The format will be a panel discussion moderated by myself, and the panel will last most of the time, and then we'll open up for Q&A afterwards. So to start, I'll ask each of our panelists to tell us a bit about their journey to their current position, and a bit about what they're doing in their current position. And once each of the panelists speaks, the other person will maybe comment or question, ask a question of what they've talked about. So let's start with Angeli. You want to kick us off and tell us a bit about your journey?
Yeah. So hi, everyone. My name is Angeli. I am one of the sociocultural research scientists at TD Bank, one of the banks in Canada. My background is originally in anthropology, and I was always very fascinated by understanding social groups and understanding the unspoken rules and structure and norms of groups of people and how they came to be. I went on to conduct a master's in anthropology, where my field site was in the Philippines, where I was trying to understand how different categories of citizenship were tied to people's identities and how this related to accumulating social and cultural capital. However, partway of my journey in academia, I had come to the decision that I wanted to do something more applied. So basically the short story is how I ended up in UXR is I ended up Googling, spending a lot of late nights Googling what to do with an anthropology degree in industry. And the results that I got were marketing research or UX research. And UX research, after reading some descriptions about what it was, really spoke to me. I thought it was a really great arena where I could apply my anthropological perspectives and skills. And then I eventually found my team at TD Bank. At TD Bank, my team is the design research team. So when I started out there almost 7 years ago now, I was the first anthropologist on the team, in a team of engineers and HCIers and psychologists. And what I was responsible for at the time was bringing an ethnographic lens and anthropological perspectives to their UX research practice. So I spent some time, a number of years on the core design research team, and I've moved into a new arm of the design research team called the research science team. So a lot of the questions that the research science team works on now is very broad and messy, as opposed to detailed research questions and projects that I was working on in the past. And things were a bit more tactical, where I had belonged to a platform and I was the main researcher for that platform. Some of the questions I'm looking at now are, what are the consequences of future technological shifts and sociocultural shifts, and how might that affect how we design our experiences and our products for our customers and for our employees as well. And I'm still working, with experienced strategists and designers, but some of our other stakeholders include enterprise banking groups and committees who have eyes on what we do now, as well as the innovation team at TD. And a lot of the work, that we do might not have an immediate effect on the current services and products that TD is designing in the next year and the next couple of years even, but it's trying to build a foundational body of research that can be used towards future products and services and experiences at TD Bank. So that's a little bit about what I do.
That's great. Johanna, any comments or questions about that?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. It's so lovely to hear your story. I was wondering, so lots of banks now I'm seeing are interested in ethnographic methods and anthropologists. Can you tell us more about like why banks and if there's more about the connection that you'd like to tell us?
Yeah, I genuinely believe that because banking and finances is a deeply personal and really intertwined with social norms, cultural expectations, and cultural norms and traditions. I think this is where anthropology and ethnography really shine in helping banks, not just look at a product or a problem on its own, but ethnography really tries to take into effect the context of a problem and looking at, not just social factors, but what does the political climate look like? What does the economic climate look like? And how is that affecting how people are making decisions when it comes to managing their resources? So I think that's where I think a lot of banks have started to see that now and have brought people like me on more and more over the years. So I think it's really great too.
I love that. That's it's so linked to, I know, your case study that you're going to share, which just pique everyone's interest there. And then you said now you're more involved in sort of generative foundational research. Do you feel like there's a connection between that and ethnographic methods?
Yes, there's a ton of connection there. I think because, we are looking at some big sociocultural shifts, right? For example, one of the things that we're really trying to think about is, as people are getting married at an older age now, how does that affect how they will think about money and pull together their resources after being entrenched and being so independent for so many years? And this foundational research, it's not really tied to any product or business line, which is really, it gives us a lot of freedom in that way. But we're trying to understand, what are some of the consequences to banking might these problems or these shifts be? So I think that's a lot of where, ethnography has a place in many things, I think, but I'm biased. But I think this is a really great application to help understand what are some of the consequences that we might see out of these big shifts.
That's great. Yeah, that was super. So about yourself, Johanna, can you tell us a bit about your journey?
Yeah, of course. So I actually didn't start out in anthropology, but I do have an anthropology background eventually. I started in biology, really entrenched in studying ecology, because I was very curious about how sort of everyday minutia of life worked, which became interesting and relevant for anthropology. I had a very typical experience of living abroad after my initial studies, translating a book and becoming really fascinated with the complexity of meaning and humans and the layers that added to your analysis. So I transitioned to anthropology, but because of this love of science still, I ended up researching the anthropology of science and then sort of relatedly medical anthropology. So for those of you who are not familiar, anthropology also looks at what's happening in biomedicine, what's happening in the lab, how are research and medicine linked together, and trying to understand the socio-political and historical context of all of that, which is such a big part of our lives and so complex as well. And so I took on a PhD in anthropology, and I didn't look at ecology. I actually ended up focusing in on neuroscience because the neurosciences became this very dominant field in the 1990s in terms of defining the human and how complex the human is. Because according to many scientists, the human brain is the quote unquote most complex scientific object. And of course, this is because it's what makes us human, according to the sciences, or it is this very central element to defining humanness. So my research ended up being all about how do scientists tackle this complexity? We think of science as being very reductive and deterministic, and what I saw when I did field work, which was in neuroscience libraries and in a psychiatric hospital, was scientists tackling complexity and trying to grapple with it, which is what, interestingly, anthropologists and ethnographers often do. And so there were some really great parallels there. To be fully honest and transparent, I didn't know anything about the methods before I started my PhD, and there is sometimes even like a mystery around them. So I find that very interesting. But there is a really interesting overlap between anthropology and this like ecology and complexity, because you're doing this research where you're trying to go into the field, quote unquote, which means going out into the real world and trying to negotiate what happens when you have many factors, many pieces coming together, and trying to disentangle these networks and relationships and interactions that you get in the world. So that was a little bit where I was doing my research and where I'm coming from in terms of my background. While I was completing my PhD, I got interested in the use of these methods, maybe in the real world, although the academia is just as much real. But I started wanting to see, like Angeli, the application in a non-academic setting. And I started working at the Innovation Hub. So the Innovation Hub is a research initiative that sits within the Division of Student Life at U of T, at the University of Toronto, and in Canada. And that's actually sitting within student services at the university. But we were doing research as opposed to actually provisioning the services. So the hub sort of functions like an internal consultancy, sort of like a UX consultancy within a bank, like Angeli might be describing, but we partner with university clients from around the university to help them understand the student experience better and using qualitative research methods. Many of them are drawn from user experience. Many of our students are familiar with that. And then many of the methods are also drawing from anthropology, and ethnography is one. The interesting thing about the Innovation Hub is that the research is all done by students. And so I actually started when I was doing my PhD. So it has this co-creation model built into it. And there's just a few staff that support it. I started as a student researcher and then worked on a project around student mental health. And found that project very difficult. The application of methods from qualitative research in this quick, fast-paced, actionable setting was definitely a challenge. for me at the start. I sort of had some trouble navigating those challenges, but I was more curious. So eventually I moved into the role of ethnography and insight lead, trying to support our researchers in being able to use the methods quickly. A lot of it was about training folks in them, and then transitioning their findings from their projects into something for our clients. And I completed my PhD and moved into the role of research lead, which let me, as a staff member, oversee and support a lot of the research that we were doing. So I was in that role for a while, but I just very, very, very recently transitioned to a new role. By very, very, very recently, I mean within the past week, to being a research lead at Bridgeable, which is a service design consultancy that's based in Toronto, that's also using human-centered research methods, some of them ethnographic, to help clients solve problems and to make the world a more human place. So most of the examples I can draw upon will be from the Innovation Hub, but happy to talk about anything.
That's great. Angeli, any comments or questions for Johanna?
Yeah, I'm just curious to hear. I mean, I think you touched very lightly on big learning curves when applying some of the ethnographic methods to client problems. What are, I guess, from an ethnographer's perspective, what are some of the biggest learning curves that you had to overcome when conducting ethnographic research in industry?
Yeah, for sure. That's an excellent question. I think, and I believe this is going to come up again, but time always is a challenge. Ethnographic research is predicated on long, in-depth, embedded timelines. So someone during my PhD told me that most projects were timelined for a year to capture like a full cycle of a community, which also has a lot of assumptions built into it because it's like they meant the full agricultural life cycle, which was not at all relevant for scientists. So the time, it's intended to really get a grasp really in depth. And of course that becomes a challenge when you're trying to do projects on really short timelines. So I think doing that, but within that, I'll say the challenge with the time also becomes translating that depth and even that chaotic, complex information into something useful very quickly. I think you have a lot of time during your PhD to digest the information and to dwell in it, and then also think about it can be like more thorough in a way, whereas now you have to be a little bit more strategic in thinking about what the information is that you pull from it.
I definitely feel that the dwelling in your findings is a very important space to be in, but oftentimes very difficult to convince people to lend you that time.
Very good. Great. Well, thanks for that. So we've got a good sense for your journey and your very interesting journeys of how you got here. It's kind of I always find I'm very boring. I feel inadequate when I hear these stories because I had a very straight arrow sort of journey. So I didn't have all these interesting, different ways and side trips and whatnot, but very interesting. So I think a good way to help people understand really what an ethnographic approach would be to UX would be to, maybe share like an example of a project you've done to give people an example of like, what would this really be like in concrete terms? So maybe Johanna, you can start us off maybe and think about maybe a project you did and tell people a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. So for me, before I dive into the project, the key to the ethnographic method is has always been sort of this participant observational element in, as I said, the real world. as opposed to a controlled setting. I'm using air quotes because, of course, it's more complicated, but a controlled setting can be something like a lab where you can control the context and the space, as well as potentially what people do in it if you're studying people in the lab. When I was at the Innovation Hub, one of the projects that we did, it was an ongoing project. It was about classroom space and technology, and then redesigning those. And the project was ongoing, so it had a number of phases. But in terms of context, so the context is that post-secondary institutions, they need to respond, of course, to the changing future of teaching, and keep teaching and classroom spaces up to date on the tech that's involved in that teaching. So technology is obviously things like computers and all the various wired things and laptops and whatnot that we use, but it's also things like the chairs and the seating arrangement and the plugs. So it's all these different aspects of what shapes the learning experience for those involved. So it was about the space and how people use that space. The project started by being about students and engaging with students. But we quickly realized that students are not the only users and not the only stakeholders involved in that classroom space, and that it involves more than just students. So we also turned to engaging in work and interviews with instructors. Those are also not the only people involved in classrooms. You also have techs and support staff. So ethnographically, we were engaging in this real space, this classroom space, and then also getting multiple perspectives, so those different people who are involved in the learning experience. And of course, now it's even more complex since the pandemic started because we've shifted to this online learning experience, which we're experiencing here today too. The ongoing question in the project was consistently, what are the various stakeholder needs in this classroom space, and how can it be how can we support them currently, and then innovating in instruction in the future. The ethnographic methods that were used were, because we were engaging with people, of course, there was lots of interviewing with all those stakeholders, and those interviews showed these really interesting findings of people really engaged in their classroom spaces and the technology very granularly, so people really care about where plugs are, for example. But we sort of dialed that out, of course, to this personal connection that people have to classrooms and their learning environments. But I'm getting a little bit ahead to the findings. In terms of other methods that were involved, we also had sort of events where people were interacting with furniture and the space. So it allowed for a more observational level of data collection. This was all before the pandemic, but people were allowed to engage and give feedback around that classroom space. So touch fabric, sit in chairs, try them out, try out different table arrangements, give feedback around what they liked, what worked for them. So it really was an attention to that space of the classroom and getting people's perspectives around it. The overall main finding was, and I don't think this is going to be shocking, but around that classrooms and its technology, it's actually all about human connection. So that needed to be put centrally into any redesign that went going forward. I think with the transition to the to online and remote learning, where classroom became completely intertwined with technology, but it also became so apparent how much human connection matters in learning. I think that really underscored the findings that had already come out. But it was a really great finding to have right at that moment because it motivated a prototype that was built around reshaping classroom tech support and how it happens. So now it's not based on the room at the university, it's actually based on the humans that are involved. So it's people-based rather than room-based. And that was initially a pilot, a small prototype pilot with 8 instructors. Now it's got hundreds of instructors and hundreds of students involved. So the ethnographic research methods were really useful in generating those initial findings to be able to drive prototypes, which used other UX methods now. So just to wrap up, there are several ways I think this exemplifies ethnographic methods. First, we were trying to bring together this sort of messier assemblage of sort of data of varying kinds that you get when you engage in the sort of real world. So you're getting all those different stakeholder perspectives on very different things, like they gave feedback on teaching podium design, on lecture style, on chairs, and the team had to bring all of that, or the teams had to bring all of that together and understand how that space played a part in the experience. And then second, it engaged in different people's perspectives, and sometimes they were conflicting, and they're all still equally important and valuable. So it brought those people and place together really well. It was an ongoing project, so it's one of the ways that it's managed to work. So yeah, happy to answer any questions about it.
Great, yeah, thank you. Angeli, any comments or questions from yourself?
First of all, that's a fascinating case study, so thanks for sharing that, Johanna. In your, I guess, when you socialize some of these findings to your stakeholders, how did you demonstrate the importance of human connection in these spaces, especially to people who may not necessarily have been there to do the participant observation? How do you get them to kind of understand the importance of this very key thing?
That's a really good question. This is the nitty gritty of it, but using quotes from interviews from students and from instructors really helps motivate change institutionally at UOT, because the admin folks are not always in touch with those people. And so that connection happens. So you get human connection, interestingly, from the direct words. So I think what's standing out to me right now the most is instructors talking about their experiences of a lecture and how things helped them. A small thing would help them work out a problem that seemed so granular, but what they would always reference was sort of the needs of the students in the end, and that they wanted the students to have this particular experience. And so it became very clear that everyone gets very caught up in, do I have the right dongle to connect? How do I call a tech support person? And there's a lot of stress and anxiety. And when those become involved, everyone focuses on these technical things. But when they were probed on why, they would be always talking about the sort of like end goal of students and their learning experiences. But it's definitely a challenge for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. So Angeli, how about yourself? Do you have an example you'd like to share with people to give people a sense for what this is like to doing this in the real world?
Yeah. So one of the case studies that I'd like to kind of showcase in the work that I've done previously is a few years ago, TD Bank wanted to redesign the referral system. So this is a system that branch employees use to other lines of businesses within TD, where they refer their customers from the branch to other lines of businesses like small business banking or investing or private banking, those pillars of businesses that we have at TD. And at the time, the problem was that TD made it mandatory to use this referral system. But even when they did that, only less than 50% of our employees were using it. And we kind of know, when companies make it mandatory to use a system and no one's using it, it's not necessarily a solution to actually using the system, but it's likely because the system is flawed and there are unmet needs there for the user. So I had really advocated for to do ethnographic methods here. And what we did was some participant observation, interviews, and multi-sited fieldwork. So we did fieldwork in a bunch of different places. And I had really advocated for multi-sited fieldwork for this work in particular, because I was kind of informed on previous studies that I had been doing with employees and at the branch level. And one of the things that I was starting to notice was how local norms really played a really big role into how colleagues did their businesses at the branch. And this was the first study that I had convinced our business to do multi-sited fieldwork, and we did some work in urban areas and also rural areas. Another reason why I had advocated for ethnographic fieldwork was because I thought it was very important to understand the entire ecosystem and the life worlds of our colleagues working at the branches, understanding the pressures that they were going through, the decisions that they had to make, and how that fit into them using or not using our referral system. So we had done some participant observation, and we also did interviews with people who made the policies for the current system. So we really wanted to understand, what the guidelines were to using the system, but we also interviewed people who we're not only using the referral system, but the people who are managing them as well. So they're branch managers and the district managers. So we could understand, what are the rules, but then also what are the rules that actually get enforced. And we found that while there were official rules on paper, so in this case, it was that 50% of the time, at the very least, referrals needed to be documented in the system. Managers and district managers really didn't care about those rules as long as sales quotas were met. And that was the metric that actually mattered and that governed a lot of their behavior. So as long as you were bringing in revenue and sales, people would really just ignore, your higher ups would really just ignore your other metrics, which was very pivotal to us understanding why the system wasn't being used. The other key finding that we found through this ethnographic research methods that we were using was that in rural settings, a branch wasn't just, a bank branch. It was part of the fabric of the town, including the people who worked in it. So the social lives of the people who worked at those branches were really intertwined with the social fabric of the town. So that meant in smaller town settings, referrals and these types of transactions, financial lives wouldn't just occur at the branch when you had an appointment with your advisor and you talked about everything, and then that was the end of that transaction. Transactions didn't end there. They also occurred during social events of the town, like, for example, the fundraiser of local hockey teams. And the investment advisor wasn't just an investment advisor from TD, but they also occupied the identity of being the local hockey coach, meaning that at game times, during halftime, people would come to them and talk to them about, some of their needs and their life goals as well. So in getting these understandings around these different contexts, we learned that the unmet needs to redesign a better system was to actually design a system where, colleagues didn't just have to use it when the customer was in front of them, but they could go and use it at other times when their businesses actually occurred. And some of those times could have been at, half times of the hockey game. And the one thing that really kind of struck us in this practice as well during this field site was that visiting in person not only allowed us to get understanding of people's day-to-day lives and the context that they worked in, but we had these we call it in between times with our participants. So it would be lunchtime, and you don't have an interview, you're not observing them, but they asked you to kind of hang out with them. You're there anyways, come have lunch with us. And during these in between times, they gave us walking tours of where they work. They gave us the history of the town and some of the politics, and that really added to this deep, rich context that painted a really detailed picture of what their lives were like and what some of the decisions that they were making. And anthropologists call this hanging out anthropology, or as one anthropologist, Clifford Geertz, calls it deep hanging. And this is where the researcher informally engages with a group, and that's when they usually get the best insights. So I think this is where a lot of ethnographic methods come to shine, and are really great for informing some of these redesigns.
Great, thank you. Johanna, anything to say about that?
For sure. A lovely example. I love every time I hear it. It's so great. You did say one of the interesting things that came out was people were sort of differentially enforcing their rules. I'm not sure if that was like hard information to get, but one thing that happens in fieldwork is you build trust with the people that you research, sometimes because you spent a lot of time with them. And it sounds like that might have happened with your deep hangs, but can you tell us more about how you built that trust? I can imagine that coming from the city to some of these spots, it's not always so easy to immediately connect with people and build that trust. So do you have any tips or what you did to help that?
Yeah. I think a big part of that, we learned kind of along the way. So depending on people's reception of us. I think one of the biggest things, you're coming from corporate offices to these branches, and people think you're there to monitor them. So I think, establishing that we are from a design team. I work for a design team at TD, and we're really here to help make your lives and redesign the system that is clearly not working for you. So establishing that as some ground rules to build some trust. I think language that tells them, we're not here to evaluate you or anything. We're here just to really understand your work. I think, some researchers find it valuable to record their sessions so they can go back on it. But I thought that was really intrusive to building trust with these people. So I left that out. I also think being cognizant of how you come across to some of these places. So trying to maybe tone down how you dress, and going with dressing a little bit more casual, so you're a little bit more approachable, really helps build that ease and that trust. So we kind of learned along the way, and for the first couple branches, we really made some mistakes there, but we kind of adjusted along the way as we did this multi-sited field work.
I love that. It is, there's something about ethnographic methods also that they are attuned to the context that they work in. So that's such a great example of it.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thanks for some great examples there. So for our final topic, I'll ask each panelist just to share some of their observations about the current state for how organizations are adopting or not adopting ethnographic practices, based on their experience, in their respective organizations, trying to apply those methods. So we'll start with, I can't remember whose turn it is. I think it's Angeli's turn to start.
Yeah, so I think that ethnographic methods are really great for at least within my organization and the experiences that I've gone through, for very messy problems. One of the things that we're looking at right now is youth culture. So youth is being defined as this age between 10 and 18. And how does, culture around digital lives, and these people are digital natives, they've never known a world without the internet? How does that affect their expectations of banking and finance? And I think that anthropology is really well placed in these very messy areas where you don't know what to do. And I think more and more, as more anthropologists do go out into industry and are using ethnographic methods to help people, not just think of a problem in silo, but understanding the full context around a problem, the politics, the economics, the social factors, the cultural shifts that are happening. I think that organizations are becoming more and more receptive to bringing ethnographers on for that reason. And I myself work with a lot of, psychologists and engineers, and we actually collaborate really well together. Sometimes there are times that there are differing perspectives. Engineers tend to look at things from a systems perspective, but layering on, that social and cultural lens is really important to all these things. So I think so far in my experience, and it's very limited, they are being quite receptive to that. I think some of the biggest challenges now that we're facing as ethnography becomes a little bit more mainstream is how do you make these findings understandable to people who might not understand what ethnography is, and how do you bring that I guess that human aspect to people who aren't necessarily coming into fields with you. I find that, myself, I get very, when I talk about some of my findings, it seems very evident to me, but because I was there to experience and see it, how do you communicate those things to people who weren't there with you and didn't experience it firsthand from themselves, in a concise and neat way as well?
Great. Yeah, good stuff. You want anything you want to follow up on there?
No, it was really wonderful. I can dive in. I feel like mine will be similar, and then maybe we'll probably end up discussing more together. If that's okay with you, Paul.
Sure, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think definitely there's a receptivity to ethnographers, for sure. I think that, and this is maybe where the methods turn, I think this speaks a lot to what Angeli was speaking to, this capacity or sensibility or attention to like the social context, those interactions, and this complex data, and synthesizing it together. I think the methods, if you've used the methods, they're really pushing you towards doing that. And I've seen a lot of discussion around people gauging people's comfort with ambiguity and uncertainty, and change. And I think these are all things about being human and about human social problems. And so the ability to hold those and to also be able to keep them in the analysis are skills that I see folks really valuing in ethnography and in ethnographers. And then also not just to hold all that, but also to be able to explain that complexity back clearly and cogently in an engaging manner is also super relevant. So a lot of overlap with what Angeli said. And maybe a word that I'm also seeing people use a lot, and I think people link to ethnography, is this storytelling aspect. And this touches upon, I think, one of the questions that have come up around like, how do we advocate for these methods when people are talking about data and big data? I feel like the sort of like contrast is storytelling in some ways. I think obviously you can partner them together, but storytelling and telling like a very small experience, something that Angeli maybe intuits in the field, but then being able to use that little nugget and dial it out to a bigger picture why. I think people have the appetite for that now, especially especially as we get really overwhelmed with data. Data is really great. Big data is really great, but it can be very overwhelming and people don't know what to do with it. So storytelling, I think, gets at some of that personal and some of that why, those why questions that people are interested in now, and that there's appetite for. But yes, definitely some of the challenges are around making it understandable. And that's what I think speaks to also what Angeli mentioned earlier on, and which we've already discussed, this connection to generative research. So ethnography can be really useful in early stages to get a sense of what the problem even is, and find out a lot about a situation and be able to like move that into findings that can inform some other research methods later on, or prototyping, or whatever it is you're doing. And in that way, I think I'm seeing a lot of connections people are making between like strategic and foresight work and ethnography. I think that there's like an attunement to these big systems thinking, but social systems thinking. And so wanting to change them is something that I think these methods are useful for, because they're thinking about that. But it is definitely difficult to digest and share with people in a digestible manner.
Great, good. So you guys did a fabulous job. Thank you very much. Just right on time. We wanted to leave a few minutes at the end for some Q&A. So we do have a few questions, which I'll read out to you. Maybe you could each have a kick at them. Yeah. So in no particular order. So maybe you could talk about methods, particularly for organizing your findings. And this person, Mark, thank you, Mark, for your question. Including the atomic research method, which is not a method I'm familiar with. So maybe if you're familiar with that method, you could describe what that is and talk about that method or other methods you might have used to organize your findings.
I'm actually unfamiliar with the atomic research method to organize my findings. I am pretty old school in the way to organize my findings, which is, you do a lot of thematic analysis, and that's really just typically after a day in the field, I will, go through some of my notes and some of my findings and write out like, these are the clear things. Basically, when you hear people saying things over and over again, and I remember asking my thesis supervisor this, I was like, how do I know when to stop collecting data and that field work is done? And she was like, when you start hearing the same things over and over again. And I was like, okay, great. So I've taken that approach to my work, and once I hear some themes that come along over and over again, I know that this is something that I need to highlight. That's really important. Or sometimes, there's even edge cases that I hear where I'm like, okay, this maybe sometimes happens, but this is a really, really important thing to highlight for a very specific group of people. But I think it's still really important to understand, and understanding which themes and edge cases and stuff to highlight really just, a lot of it is up to the researcher's decision, but it's, knowing about like, what are your stakeholders' questions? What is what are the goals of this project? What are you trying to understand? I think like just knowing that helps bubble up some of those themes when doing this analysis. Oftentimes I end up coming out with way more data than I had expected to when I come back from fieldwork, and I organize some of my findings as to like primary findings, meaning does this answer the exact research question that we set out to answer? And then secondary findings are, these are things that are related to the primary research question, but not necessarily answer it directly, but are factors in which we need to take into account. And then I've got, sometimes tertiary findings, which are like nice to haves, but more of like, oh, this is interesting things that maybe we need to consider down the line. So I've done that approach previously.
Great. Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in before we turn to Johanna. Just curious. So in your description, it sort of sounded like that was a single person type sort of analysis. Are other people involved in trying to make sense of the data together? Or is that more of a solo type analyst activity in your practice?
Yeah, it depends on the project. I've been on projects where we've had like the entire research team and it was all hands on deck, trying to analyze a bunch of data. And that was really, really fun in the sense that, like, you know, it was like a panel and you had to defend why these themes should be the ones that we showcase. And then sometimes, you know, it's just me and like two other researchers, and then sometimes it's just me alone. And I think being alone is probably the hardest. You're sometimes, you know, you're with designers and other people who might be there as well. But I think when you're the only person there, it's tough because I often honestly second guess myself. Is this important? Is this something we have to highlight? Does it go? Or, you know, but you get some practice with learning that. And it's honestly like a skill. I think just the key things are coming out, you know, coming with set research questions. These are the goals that we're trying to answer, and then going from there is really important, because ethnographic fieldwork can go on forever. Maybe not forever, but, you know, a long time.
Great. Yeah, and Johanna, yourself. So, any tips or tricks for practices for how you organize your findings and research?
I found that description really excellent. I guess I would add, have for sure, looking for patterns, thematic analysis. That's always really useful. Maybe I'd add one thing that I think about is going sort of to make sure what you're finding is always evidenced in the data. I think about it as you have your sort of grounds, your evidence on one side, and then you have your goals on the other side, those questions you want to answer. And so, like, ping-ponging always between the two, getting immersed in the data and spending some time there to really find some patterns that are interesting, or those edge cases. I think about them as puzzles, which I'll explain in just a sec. But and then don't spend too much time there because it can go on forever and you can rabbit hole. So always returning back to make sure you're sort of on track to answering certain questions. And then making sure you understand those and whether or no those need to be adjusted for any reason based on your data. But then also looking back, you know, how did I find this insight in the data? What more can I dig into? I think that's really helpful to me. So thinking about it as this oscillating movement. I find, and this is not just useful for analysis, but also what to pay attention to when you're in the field. Somebody taught me this in my PhD, and I really appreciate it, to pay attention to things that puzzle you. Puzzlement is really useful because it's a feeling, like if you get confused, but then it's also like an analytic thing. There's something like puzzling going on. There's sort of like a problem. So using that first initial feeling to like find the puzzle can be useful. And then also later on, using the puzzle to think about like, what are all the pieces that are involved? What's the contradiction or tension, or is there ambivalence? I find that useful later in the analysis as well. And it's really great to do in teamwork because you can be puzzled early on because you just don't fully get something, and either your team can't answer it really quickly and you're like, okay, that's not a puzzle. I just like didn't get that. Or as a team, you suddenly realize, no, like, oh, that's a spot where we should dig into and where there might be something interesting. So yeah, that's just something I'll share for analysis.
Great. And maybe just sort of going off that. So I guess someone mentioned earlier about storytelling, and maybe storytelling is sort of certainly a subsequent, once you've done the analysis, you've got some story to tell, you know, trying to make that story. So maybe it'd be interesting to hear from either of you about, in particular, you know, storytelling from an ethnographic perspective. Like, everyone's a storyteller, but what makes someone from, you know, someone with your background, what's special about the stories that you would tell? So maybe we'll start with Johanna this time. Any thoughts on your storytelling chops?
Oh, it's always something I feel like I could be better at. I I think one thing is you engage so empathetically with your people that you're talking to in your research in ethnography. So you really understand their lens. So if you can tell the story, especially about something that they might do that you thought was peculiar before, this is very classic. Make the strange familiar move in anthropology. So if you can make something they do that's sort of surprising and sort of maybe management thinks they're doing it wrong, but you explain like, oh no, here's like the great rationale for what they're doing, and they have a great design idea that we could use. I think that kind of story can come from this ethnographic lens.
Great. And Angeli, and what yourself?
Make the strange familiar is a great one. It was a great reminder to the paper that I remember reading early on. I think that building, the context around the story, I use a lot of big data to build the context in my stories to say, this is what we're seeing from the numbers. So we've decided to go into it, and I think you're just really just taking them through the context and really understanding the life worlds of these people. So meaning that you're understanding people's worlds from their perspective. I think that if I can come away with that, it's a really powerful tool. One of the things that I remembered, and I've tried to apply in my own work, it's something that we use a lot in academia. It's called Ethnographic Vignettes. And it's really just, basically it's like a snapshot of like a very specific story where you see something strange. It's kind of what Johanna talked about with something that puzzled you and confused you at first. And then you build on that story, and it usually has it's tied to a lot of the themes that you see in the research that you're doing. And I've used those techniques to kind of tell the story. You're using a little snapshot in time, but it's intertwined with all these other larger themes at hand. So yeah, that's kind of some of the things I've done.
Great, good. So I'm just mindful of the time here. I'm expecting the host to come on any time, and look at that, he's here. Amazing. Well, thank you very much. That's all for us. So back to you.
Thank you very much. Great discussion. I've been looking forward to this chat, and it was really nice. And thank you for the stories and the deep dives. There were a couple of questions that are not yet answered. Are you okay to go into your Q&A session to potentially answer those questions if anyone joins there?
Sure.
Very good. So you'll be able to find that if you go. So in the top left corner, you see a blue little circle. You can click on that to go to the interface that the attendees are seeing. And you'll be able to, on the left-hand side, go to sessions and there find your session and join that. And for anyone who wants to join and sort of listen into some further discussions with this group, you can follow them. So go to sessions and search out TorChi's session on ethnography and user research. And I will also go back into the background, but first, on some of our sponsors. Thank you, Overflow. Thank you, Rosenfeld Media. Thank you, UX Testing. Thank you, Xsure. Thank you, UXBA. And thank you for being here, all of you, for making this possible and really making this an event that we decide that we do sort of year on and on. So thank you again for Toronto. I'll remove you from the stage.